Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's event discussion, place-based policymaking in cities after 2020. It's my pleasure to welcome you here today. My name is Ryan Streeter. I'm the Director of Domestic Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, and it's a real pleasure to be joined today by such a distinguished group of panelists to talk about the status of our cities, both during and after this pandemic that we're in, what we think it means for the future of policymaking, in particular as we focus on places that are distressed and in need of some help. Joining us today are four panelists that need very little introduction because of the breadth and exposure of their work. Well, I'll briefly do that, and you can read about their bios more fully on our website. I'm joined by John Lettieri, who's the co-founder and president of the Economic Innovation Group, a policy advocacy and research shop here in DC. I say here in DC because that's where I am as well. We're also joined by Ed Glaeser, who is the Fred and Eleanor Glimp Professor in Economics at Harvard, as well as being a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and contributing editor of City Journal. Also Adam Ozimek, who is the chief economist at Upwork, which is a freelancing platform. And he was most recently a senior economist at Moody's Analytics, where he focused on US demographics, forecasts, and research. And then finally, Renn, who's an urban analyst and columnist with Governing Magazine and a contributing editor at City Journal and formerly with the Manhattan Institute. So it's a real pleasure to have all of you here with me today, and I look forward to this discussion. Just a quick bit of housekeeping for those who are watching today. We will take questions towards the back end of our time together, and the way to put your questions in a queue, and you can do this at any time during the discussion, you don't have to wait until the end, is one of two ways. Either email @AEI or use our Twitter handle to submit your questions. So by email, you would want to send that to Kawit, K-A-W-I-T .promrat, P-R-O-M-R-A-T, at AEI.org. Or on Twitter, hashtag place-based policymaking. That's place-based policymaking, all one word. So if you have questions at any time, go ahead and submit those one of those two ways, and we'll put them in a queue and take those questions as they come in. All right, very good. Well, I'd like to turn this over to our panelists to start thinking through what's next for cities. And John Lettieri, if I could call on you first, I'd be curious to know, just based on the work that your group, EIG, has done, particularly in your production of the Distressed Communities Index, that has been an incredibly useful tool for looking at stagnating, declining, and prospering zip codes in the country. I'm just curious to know what you and your colleagues are most concerned about right now when it comes to our cities around the country as we head into 2021. Are those concerns different now because of the pandemic, or are your concerns similar to what we had going into the pandemic?
Sure. Well, thanks, Ryan, and thanks for hosting this important discussion. So you mentioned the Distressed Communities Index. For those who may not be familiar, that's a measure that we have designed to look at the relative well-being of places across the country. And in our latest iteration of that project, we looked back to the year 2000 to see how the spatial distribution of well-being in our country has changed over the course of the 21st century. And what we find is pretty clearly a story of the urbanization of prosperity and the ruralization of distress. And I think that tracks largely with what has become conventional wisdom, that cities are becoming more vibrant and more prosperous on the whole. Obviously, there's some notable exceptions, but that the return to density and agglomeration is continuing, and that rural areas, relatively speaking, are becoming further and further behind. That takes us up to the economy we had coming into the recession, coming into this crisis. And so I think my concerns are more questions than anything else. One of the big questions is, how significant of a setback for cities in particular will the COVID crisis be? What kind of long-term effects will that have? And will it reverse that trend towards the urbanization of prosperity that we saw coming into the election? Certainly, one other thing we see in the context of the election is that the spatial distribution of prosperity and dynamism in our country tracks very closely with the red-blue partisan divide. And this is becoming increasingly true over time. Just today, we put out a new analysis of Biden and Trump voting counties, and we really find an enormous divide, a stark difference between the places in our country that are economically vibrant and dynamic, places with high startup rates, places with strong population growth, places that are netting the lion's share of job and business creation, and those that aren't. And you can really divide the Trump and Biden electorate along those lines. And just a couple stats to throw at you on this: the Biden voting counties accounted for 83% of all net new firms in the country over the last 10 years, 73% of all net new jobs, and about 2/3 of national population growth. So those dual trends, the urbanization of prosperity and the spatial organization of the economy and how that's concentrating in fewer and fewer places over time, is definitely driving much of the social and political polarization, at least has a strong relationship to those trends that we see.
Mm. Yeah, those are pretty astounding numbers. And we'll come back and talk policy a little bit later. But just right off, is a kind of immediate follow-up question. When you talk about the sort of political divide in terms of productivity, startup rates and all that stuff, 70% of the economy being in sort of Biden territory and 80+% of the startups, does that have immediate political consequences in your mind? I mean, obviously this is spread out across a country where you have different types of municipalities being governed differently. It certainly seems like it's got to be contributing to some of the polarization we see just in terms of attitudes. Is there anything else specifically just in terms of sort of actual effects that you're worried about?
I certainly worry about the idea that if you have such a significant chunk of the country by place and by population that feels disconnected from the national growth story, that's going to have ramifications that could lead us to pull back on the very things that make the economy successful. And we know that the relationship between being relatively isolated physically and isolated from growth, economic growth, is correlated with a suspicion about globalization, about immigration, about trade, about many of the key building blocks of our economy. And I think we see that playing out. We've been seeing that playing out for years now on the national stage. But I think the key here is that those trends seem to be accelerating and reinforcing themselves rather than dissipating over time. And I think this is one of the big challenges that President-elect Biden is going to inherit, is whether those divides can be breached. And as I'm sure we'll talk about later, whether there is a place-based policy agenda that can help to bridge some of the chasm that we see opening up here.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Ed, if I could bring you in here, I'd be curious to know kind of what your projection for our major metros is. I know you've written about how urbanization excelled after the flu 100 years ago. So it seems like cities have a pretty strong history of bouncing back. And I'm just curious, as you kind of look out over the next year and you think about kind of urbanization and also uneven kind of urbanization, or where there's inequality, what's your kind of prognosis for U.S. cities for this coming year?
So I think there are really two possibilities going forward. The one, which is really quite dark, is the possibility that this pandemic, that these vaccines, which we've received all this hopeful news about, will not pan out, that we'll have several more years of this pandemic and then another one in the next 5 to 10 years. That's a pretty terrible world for America's cities, for most of the rich world cities. And indeed, it's a terrible world for all of those Americans whose jobs depend upon face-to-face contact. I mean, prior to COVID-19, 32 million Americans, 1/5 of the labor force, were in leisure, hospitality, and retail trade. Those jobs were a safe haven for Americans who didn't have advanced degrees from MIT when automation came, when outsourcing came, because people were willing to pay a little bit of extra for a latte that's served with a smile. But of course, when that smile turns into a source of peril rather than a source of pleasure, those jobs can disappear in a heartbeat. And of course, that's what we've seen. So that's a very tough world. The world in which the vaccines pan out, in which America makes the steps that we probably should take to make sure this is a one-off event, that this really doesn't happen again for another 100 years, which is about the time that we've had since the last major pandemic, that is still a tough world for cities. Okay, and let's just go through why cities are going to be facing a bit of an uphill battle. So in terms of the fiscal distress, America's cities are stressed, public transportation systems are stressed. And not only that, there are a lot of voices right now which are arguing for turning cities into forms of local redistribution, for really a sort of tax and redistribute model, which is reminiscent of the 1970s. That's a very dangerous thing to do at any level, but especially at the local level, because as we know, particularly in a world that's sort of post-Zoom, the rich businesses can easily relocate. And so the mobility of businesses means that cities can get themselves into a lot of trouble if they try to essentially treat their local businesses not as the source of their economic vitality, but as a piggy bank to be mined. Second point is that there's a danger, there's a difficulty which will come from the fact that we've all moved so comfortably to video conferencing. Now, by we all, I mean those of us who are in the lucky, highly educated, idea-oriented part of the global economy, right? Almost 70% of those Americans who have advanced degrees were teleworking in May. By contrast, only 5% of those Americans without college degrees were teleworking in May. So it's important to remember that this teleworking world leaves behind vast numbers of Americans. But there's, in our surveys of business owners in the Alignable Network, in the National Association of Business Economists, we get numbers like something like 40% of firms say that 40% or more of workers who have switched to remote will stay remote. I don't know how true that will turn out, but those numbers translate to about 10 million people moving from showing up in their offices to not showing up in their offices. That will not necessarily create large numbers of vacancies in our most successful cities because real estate markets will adapt. Commercial landowners will lower the prices. Younger firms will replace older firms, and residences will replace commercial users. But it'll still be a bumpy ride going forward. And I think, because of those reasons, I could not be more long-term optimistic about the ability of cities to thrive even in a world of electronic communication. For 40 years, for my entire life, the cyberseers and the technoprophets have been predicting that technology will make face-to-face contact and the cities that enable that contact obsolete. That hadn't happened up until 2019 at all, right? And it's not going to happen now. But we do expect to have some workers, many workers, in fact, stay Zooming afterwards. And that's going to create a short-term transition path that's going to be a little bit hard. Again, I think that the long-term patterns will probably persist, but the next year will be rough, Ryan. I mean, I would expect the next 3 to 5 years will be rough. It's the 10-year horizon that I'm optimistic about, at least if we make sure that this pandemic is a one-off event.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Yeah, the prophets of the internet in the 90s, I remember, prophesied two things. One is that we would start leading decentralized lives, cities would become irrelevant, and two, we would have an open platform for democratic dialogue, and there'd be greater unity. So I think
100% wrong. Both.
Yeah, it seems like both of those predictions kind of went off the rails. Just a quick follow-up, Ed. In terms of the biggest losers, in what the scenario you're talking about, as people begin to move. Or continue to move, and let's take the more optimistic scenario. The vaccines are out. We're kind of returning to normal. As people make different decisions about relocating now, maybe a little bit different before the pandemic because of remote work. Do you think that the biggest losers are going to be kind of the big expensive places that are already kind of starting to lose? I mean,
maybe I would think. I mean, the most likely winners are going to be middle density, high amenity places that are attractive to footloose tech workers. So think Vail, think Boulder, think the places that are sort of high amenities and a little bit less expensive and less difficult than San Francisco. The places that are likely to experience the most dysfunction are the sort of dense cities that had vacancies beforehand. So the Rust Belt cities that were troubled to begin with, those are the places I think that are likeliest to have the ongoing, the places that combine density and not, weren't seen by their residents as being super high amenities. Those are likely to be kind of difficult areas. And the sort of expensive places that were stuttering beforehand, I think that they will continue to stutter. I think it'll be hard. I agree with that, Ryan. But I don't believe we'll have sort of large scale social distress or vacancies. I think you'll just see a significant correction in a number of urban property markets that may take a while to work its way out. And obviously, we're going to also see probably an accelerated transition of this sort of general decline in retail spaces that sell goods. And eventually that will be replaced by retail spaces that sell experiences. That's what we've seen over the past 8 years, that sort of transition. But that's going to be a little bit slowed because of the fear of face-to-face contact.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. Well, Adam, let me turn to you here and get your thoughts on this, because I know you've done quite a bit of work on what the future of remote work looks like, and have written about and talked about its effect on where people choose to locate. So I'm curious to know how you see this kind of post-pandemic, this whole remote work phenomenon, what it actually means for migration and what that actually means for kind of first and second tier cities.
Yeah, so I think I'm about the same order of magnitude as Ed in terms of the long term for remote. I think it's going to be probably around, based on my surveys of hiring managers, CEOs, and small business owners. I think it's probably going to be around 20% of the workforce is remote long run. So that's pretty close to where Ed's at. And I think that compared to where we are now, that seems like, oh, well, a lot of people are going to go back to work because we're probably still, around a third, maybe 40%. So, and at the peak, we were probably at like 60%. So it's like, okay, a lot of people are going back to work, but 20% of the workforce is a lot. It's a really big number. That's really impactful, even if you can describe that as most people have gone back to the office, right? So that's sort of where I think we're going to end up. And I do think that this is going to have the most negative impacts on the most expensive places, because right now, the most expensive places, when you're talking about superstar cities, a lot of their value is built from access to agglomeration, which they have a monopoly on right now. And I think what we're going to see is a weakness of that monopoly, both in terms of now it's easier to live in outerlying counties outside of these superstar cities, and also in terms of, you can get a job at a tech company easier than you used to in 2018, 2019. You don't necessarily have to live in San Francisco to get access to that. So, and we have some survey data. We did a survey of 20,000 people and asked, are you planning on moving out of the area because of remote work, because of COVID? So like trying to be very specific about what was driving it there. And we found between 7 and 11% of people are planning on moving, and the out-migration rates are going to be highest in major metro areas and then suburbs outside major metro areas. So I do think that those places are going to take the out-migration hit. Now, that said, I agree entirely with Ed that the long run, the story is still positive. I mean, there's a lot of reasons to want to live in a city. And right now, as a loose approximation, every single person who leaves San Francisco, there's someone else who's willing to move in at a slightly lower price. Same thing for New York City. And this is going to be good news for people who want to live there for the amenities and weren't necessarily wanting to live there for the, super high priced tech jobs. But it is a transition path. And I think how bad that gets depends on how bad this recession is, and also how the cities respond, because it's a very negative fiscal shock, and you have to worry about the governance problems in these cities, that they're going to do things that are make adjustments that are counterproductive. And even if they make the right adjustments, you have a negative feedback effect on service quality, right? Like, this is going to hurt school districts, property tax revenues go down. Like, sure, some of that money is wasted right now, but that money goes to services, and so you have to worry about the negative feedbacks that makes the transition path tough as well. So that's what I think we're looking at. In terms of who's going to win, I think that lower cost of living places are going to see the benefit. You can actually see this already in the real estate data too. The highest cost of living places are the ones that have seen double-digit declines in rents, whereas lower cost of living places are seeing gains or no changes. And I think it's also important to distinguish between cities, because there are going to be cities who win from this. And I don't think it's necessarily just about, saying Rust Belt cities lose as well because they have higher vacancies to begin with, because I think that a lot of those places are going to be seen as reasonable destinations when you're moving out of San Francisco, New York. You still want to be in an urban environment, but you're looking for lower cost of living places. I mean, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, like those places have amenities. They don't have the amenities of San Francisco and New York City, but they do have amenities. Philadelphia is another great example. That's a really low cost of living. The amenity levels may not compete with New York City, Washington, DC, but like that's a really big step down in cost of living. And by the way, still is, you can get on Amtrak and get to New York and DC. So I think, how these sort of struggling cities, lower cost cities do is going to be kind of a case by case basis and depend on their mix of, amenities and how close they are to superstar cities, stuff like that.
Yeah. And when you ask questions in your survey about moving, that 7 to 11% people that you were talking about, does the question ask if they're planning on moving from one metro to another, or does that account for people moving sort of intra metro, moving from the denser part of the city out to the exurbs or something?
So we specifically say out of the area to try to focus on the longer term moves. I think we hadn't said out of the area, it would have been an even higher number, but it was, about 50% of them, I think a little over 50% were over 2-hour moves, and 40% of them are over 4-hour moves. So a 4-hour move is pretty safely out of the metro area for most metro areas.
And what are the reasons? I mean, it would, this is useful for if you're a mayor or city councilors and you're trying to think about the future, the reasons why people are relocating seem to become important to you. This is different than in the past, right? If I was a tech worker in the San Jose metro area and I got tired of high prices and I could get a job in Austin, I moved to Austin because it's, the pay is good, the quality of life's good, all that stuff. But now if I want to move out of the San Jose area, I could still get that job in Austin, but probably work from somewhere else. And I might choose not to go to Austin, but to go to somewhere else for these other reasons now. What do you think are kind of the primary drivers? And so amenities has come up a number of times. I assume that's a driver.
It's interesting because, spatial economic theory would have told us before that competition among cities is this really important sort of way that they try to lure in residents. Call it tie-bout competition. But I think what actually ended up happening was the way a lot of places competed was through crony capitalism. Like, how can you lure in the biggest employers with the biggest handouts to take up the biggest office space? And now if what we're seeing is not tech companies picking where their workers are going to live, but tech workers picking where they're going to go, then I sort of think it brings back time-out competition to the forefront and more of a focus on amenities and making sure that what you pay in taxes you're getting back in amenities. So I think that's the balance. What is the cost of living here, and what you get for that cost of living in terms of amenities and quality of life.
Thanks. Aaron, you are back in the Midwest after a stint, I know, of a number of years in New York, and you write a lot about and think a lot about the Midwest. What's your kind of take right now on Midwestern cities that seem to be bouncing back or showing signs of bouncing back? Why is that? Where are spots of hope, or what are the attributes of places that have reason to be more hopeful right now?
Well, there are quite a few cities that were doing well pre-pandemic in the Midwest, Greater Heartland area. A lot of them have a profile similar to some of the Sun Belt boom towns. So they tend to be state capitals or university towns, ones that are comparatively amenity rich or which have knowledge economy assets. So you could think of Pittsburgh, Columbus, Ohio, Indianapolis, Kansas City, Madison, Wisconsin, West Lafayette, Indiana. Places like that were doing pretty well, if not achieving the levels of growth that these Sun Belt cities are, mostly because the migrants into these cities come from predominantly in-state. So these have become essentially local talent magnets, but have not really become national talent magnets in the way that a Nashville or an Austin was, if you look at the migration patterns. And I don't see that the pandemic is really going to change that. If you look at the work from home statistics, it had been a secular increasing trend for some time. We were at 3.3% work from home in 2000. We were at 4.3 in 2010 and 5.7% in 2019. So we were seeing an increase at an increasing rate. There are now, in 2019, pre-pandemic, 1.2 million more people working from home than there were taking public transit to work in the United States. And so this is something we already saw. And if we look at where those people were moving, you see that the top places for work from home were predominantly usual suspect cities. They are medium density, smaller cities, the exact ones that Ed said, or kind of resort retirement destinations. So number one in the country, Boulder, Colorado, 13.7% work remote. So my hypothesis would be people want to move to Boulder, and they're using the remote work to get there because it's just not easy enough to find a job there. We also see Bend, Oregon, St. George, Utah, Austin, Texas, Raleigh, Fort Collins, places like that. So to the extent that we have an increase in remote work, we might see more people moving to the same places, and maybe an acceleration of that trend. I think an increase in remote work clearly increases the criticality of place as a determining factor in attracting residents. So if you could think about Nationwide Insurance in Columbus, Ohio, Eli Lilly here in Indianapolis, Procter & Gamble in Cincinnati, any major corporate employers that you have in your town. A lot of the people who moved to your city from out of state were people who graduated from college and got a job at one of those great employers. And to the extent that there is a shift to become more location agnostic by some of these companies, that means these cities are no longer going to be able to rely on the job to bring people there, because people are going to take their job at, whatever corporate HQ in Cincinnati, perhaps, and then they're going to move to Nashville, maybe because they want to live in Nashville. So I think, to the extent that there's location independence in work, it's certainly going to increase the criticality of place as a place to go. I do find it interesting that people are sort of going to places that are emerging talent magnets. They're not going to some small town in wherever. Yes, I think the Intermountain West has seen some of that, the Mountain West, some of these smaller places in Idaho and Montana. There just aren't a lot of cities out there. But I don't think there's going to be a great repopulation of a lot of these left behind cities because all of a sudden everyone is leaving New York. But I do think from a city like Indianapolis, where I'm at now, I would say the to-do is the same as it was before, to increase the attractiveness of place so that people who do not have an existing connection to the state of Indiana in some return decide to look at this place in the same conversation that they would look at a Nashville, Tennessee, for example. And none of the Midwestern cities have really cracked the code on that. I just want to echo something on the bigger cities. I would never count New York out. I mean, if you look at New York in the 70s, New York's population decline from peak at the worst of the worst for the era of the American city was like maybe 15% or less. New York never lost a huge number of people like a lot of other cities did, even when it was a war zone. But I do think there's a big challenge that's similar to that era, in that many of these cities had kind of gotten kind of fat, dumb, and lazy, and had embraced very poor governance. They have not been willing to deal with problems like homelessness. They are in effect depolicing at the same time that crime is high, murder rates are going up, maybe not high by 1993 standards, but so a significant increase in murders. And they're facing fiscal distress that's going to threaten critical services like the New York subway, without which those cities are not particularly functional. So I think the risk to them is some sort of a governance failure that leads to a declining public service spiral, which is really necessary, to have a humane existence in those places. But assuming they don't fall into it, I think after a period of this 3 to 5 year distress, they should be positioned to pull back, because there is pretty much an unlimited number of people who want to move to places like New York or San Francisco if the price is right.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. Okay, well, it kind of sets me up to turn a little bit more now to a discussion about sort of policy or issues that need to be addressed. Before I do that, I do just want to remind viewers that if you have a question, you can get those in the queue. Hashtag place-based policymaking on Twitter, or email kowit.promrat@aei.org if you have a question. So I wanted to just pick up on something that Aaron was talking about there and ask, what, as well, really picking up on what all of you said, but one of the things Aaron just said prompted the thought, is that, as we have an upwardly mobile, highly educated, and therefore geographically mobile population moving around, like we've been talking about, choosing to work remotely from a city with high amenities, we also now have neighborhoods within cities and outlying areas where people can't move, or people won't for a variety of reasons, which do face a lot of headwinds and challenges right now. And so I wanted to turn a little bit to a discussion about what the chief characteristics of these places are, and then what we think it means for policy. So I'd kind of like to just go around and get each of your thoughts on, if you are advising policymakers, and I'm going to leave the level of government to you. I mean, whether we're talking about mayors or governors or federal policymakers, what do you think are the places that we would consider stagnating, depending, and use your own definition for that? Why are they stagnating, and then what policy tools would you recommend that people start looking at? John, I know you've given this a lot of thought. I know you're doing a lot of work in this regard. I'd kind of like to turn to you first and just get your take on that. What's really driving stagnation right now, or creating it, and what's the best kind of first step?
Well, it's a big question. I think the characteristics of places that are really struggling often boil down to disconnectedness. You certainly see this in struggling rural areas. Rural areas that tend to do well are in relatively close proximity to larger thriving metros. That's why you see a lot of rural prosperity in the Mountain West, where you have a lot of fast growing places in Colorado, Utah, et cetera. So you have high amenity rural areas in close proximity to larger fast growing metros. So the disconnectedness is one of the big challenges for policymakers to tackle. Disconnectedness from capital markets, from human capital, from corporate investment, and from key anchor institutions. And these are not always problems that there's an easy or obvious policy solution for. So I think there's two things here, and this is why I'm not in politics. One is you have to accept the fact that there are a certain subset of places that are struggling today that are going to decline indefinitely, and that there's probably not a reasonable policy solution to address that, at least not something that can be done from the outside as an intervention. But I think there's a whole host of places that are in the balance, for whom there could be meaningful interventions. And we've just never had as a country, at least not in modern history, a really all-in effort to look at what are the kind of tools. So I'll answer your question in the context of the federal government. What kind of national place-based agenda could we implement that provides tools and resources and even just data to track this challenge, and to identify places that are beginning their decline before they hit rock bottom? Because most of the interventions that we do attempt tend to be once a place has really bottomed out, once you've hit the crisis kind of distressed phase. And I think we do much better if we try to identify places and make some of those interventions before hitting rock bottom. And so I think you can think about this through two primary lenses, or two obvious ones. One is investment capital and the investment side of the equation, that type of capital, and the other is human capital. And it's something that I'm biased here. Obviously, this is something that Adam and I have worked on together, and that we've been happy to see get traction. But on the human capital side, there aren't many levers you can pull that address the significant slowdown demographically that the country as a whole is experiencing. That it's especially true in economically stagnant areas of the country. But we do have this amazing national advantage, which is that smart people from around the world want to be here, and would want to be here in much higher numbers if we were to allow them to. And we've never really leveraged that in an intentional way to help address this other challenge of regional divergence and economically and demographically struggling communities. And so we think that's one of the areas where there's an obvious experiment worth endeavoring in, which is to use place-based, location-based visas that open up new channels for people who would want to be here, who would happily settle in Indianapolis or in Akron, or you name the place, but for whom there's not really a viable path today. And to tap into the entrepreneurial talent, the STEM talent, and all kinds of other talent as well that can be both important supply and critical demand for these local labor markets and economies that without new resources and new interventions are really not likely to see a dramatic turnaround based on the current trends.
Thanks. And Ed, is it a correct characterization to say you've kind of moved from a more to less skeptical point of view on place-based sort of development over time, or not?
I believe that federal placemaking needs to take more account of place. Federal policy needs to take more account of place than it has in the past. I agree with that. I remain committed to the view that we do not want to tax the entrepreneurs and businesses in our most successful areas in order to prop up declining places. But we do want policies that recognize the differences across the U.S. I want to just start by, echoing something that's been said throughout, and just saying something about local policymaking, though. And wherever you are, I'm going to continue with the same mantra I have been giving for at least the past 10 years, if not longer, which is the right policy for local decision makers is to try and attract and train smart people and then get out of their way. Human capital is the bedrock on which local success rests. Training is critically part of that, of course, but so is attracting. And I'm really trying to echo Aaron here. I'm echoing Adam. And what COVID-19 has done has, if anything, made us even more footloose. This is a 200-year process, right? Where in the 19th century, the location of cities was determined by natural resources, determined by proximity to the coal mines, proximity to the waterways. Over the course of the 20th century, we freed up our businesses, but still people were tied to their businesses. What remote working does is it frees people to even leave their businesses entirely. And that makes the power of place as an amenity provider even stronger. And one thing that we've really seen during the COVID pandemic is maybe we can work remotely via Zoom. Maybe we don't lose that much. I'm not sure. I think time will only tell. But it certainly is a heck of a lot less fun. It certainly is a lot less joyful. And the human demand to be back in face-to-face settings is just shown every time we loosen a regulation and we see a flood of 19-year-olds who want to start living their life live again, just reinforces how much we are a social species that thrives by being around other human beings. And I think for that reason, those cities that are able to deliver that really is absolutely crucial. I'm a little more with Aaron than I am with Adam in terms of which cities those are. I see a lot of upside in, of course, the traditional Sunbelt cities and the boulders, but also like a lot to like about Columbus, a lot to like about about Madison. I'm a little bit less optimistic about some of the traditional Rust Belt cities, but I'm rooting for them too, Adam. So I'm not gonna pick a fight with you on that. Now, in terms of what the federal government's gonna do, if you'll forgive me, I want to share one slide. I promise you just one,
Sure.
Just one slide in terms of what I think about as being American distress. And this is the map that I always have in the back of my mind. This is a map of the share of prime-aged men, and male men out of the labor force are just an easier phenomenon than women out of the labor force. The geographic map of this. Now, globally, of course, we've gone from 5% of prime-aged men who are not working 50 years ago to, over the past decade, more than 15% of prime-aged men have been not working for most of this time period. And of course, it is not spatially neutral. It is particularly concentrated in this wedge right here in the American Eastern Heartland, where there are some areas where more than 1 in 4 prime-aged men are not employed, are not either, they're either unemployed or they're not looking for work. Note that, in fact, the gap that John was talking about in terms of sort of Trump versus Biden voters, there are plenty of, at least on this map, there's plenty of Trump country here that is in fact perfectly functional along this map. The Western Heartland has a lot to like, and it does provide the Eastern Heartland with maybe some helpful examples other than the coast. I think that this is a huge American trauma. I think that the part of the political elite who says, oh, it's okay, we'll just give them universal basic income, they will survive, is it making a terrible mistake? Because a sense of life satisfaction, a sense of purpose, a sense of some buy-in with our country depends on what comes from work, comes from social connection, comes from a sense of purpose on this world. And so I really think we need to have federal policies that recognize the difference between West Virginia and Seattle, that recognize the difference between Louisiana and Boston. And I think I just want to highlight a couple of key things, one of which is the need for entitlement reform, the need to make sure that we don't have policies like disability insurance, particularly in West Virginia, particularly in the Eastern Heartland, that do so much to discourage work. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm going to rip away people's DI payments, but I think a system that maybe has a lower base payment and then enables people to keep more of their earnings so it doesning discourage them from work, which is exactly what the experiments in Norway have shown us. I think those are great things to be working on in the Eastern Heartland. Thinking about reform in terms of other social policies that tax work, including Section 8 housing vouchers and food stamps in the Eastern Heartland is also reasonable. And then, of course, thinking about credits for actually creating jobs, whether or not this is a worker-based credit like the earned income tax credit, or something like payroll tax relief for firms that create new businesses in the Eastern Heartland also makes sense to me. But doing something that doesn't try to redistribute from rich places to poor places, but recognizes that just a policy, an employment policy that is designed for Seattle is just going to be a very poor mix for a place where 25% of prime-age men are jobless, and you just want a different set of policies around that, and that's the way that I've really evolved, Ryan.
Thank you. Adam and Aaron, do you want to weigh in too on policy levers that we can build on later?
I mean, I have a couple ideas on this, and I just look at the basic problem in a lot of these post-industrial and rural areas in that being rooted in the fact that the geography of our cities and distribution of our population is not aligned with the post-industrial economy that we've been moving to. When we switch from an agricultural to an industrial economy, we went from a predominantly rural population to a predominantly urban population. We had to switch to align our geography of place with the geography of the economy. And so we have all these mid-sized manufacturing cities in the Midwest that were part of that agro-industrial complex around, autos in Detroit and whatever was in Chicago, around meat packing and manufacturing. And now that we have a different economic base, those cities are really not aligned with it. So I think in a lot of ways, we're pushing on a string if we try to reflate some of these smaller places with very low educational attainment, very low, amenity bases, not a lot of, high quality universities, far from a major metropolitan area and an airport, et cetera. What I see is the thing that can be done is to ensure that the people who choose to live there have, basic quality public services on which lower income people heavily rely. And to do that, I say, how do we essentially financially restructure them? And, how do we put in place policies that make it possible for good basic quality public services to be delivered? One intervention I've always said is the federal government should fund 100% of all combined sewer overflow remediation in the United States. By far the largest capital project in almost every older city in the United States is fixing old sewer lines so they don't overflow into area streams during heavy rains. They're spending 4-point-something billion in St. Louis, 2.7 billion in Cleveland, a couple billion here. I mean, the money that's being imposed on Youngstown, Ohio, Akron, Ohio, almost entirely paid for by local ratepayers, is crazy. We can't reflate your economy, but we can fix your sewers. So I think something that fixes the finances around pensions, very important. So I would look to, migrate public employees to define contribution style retirement accounts. I would also look to essentially not necessarily freeze all the current participants, but to make sure that we're not getting some of these ridiculously continuously compounded COLAs and stuff forever. And then I think once you've moved everyone so there could be no further people in a defined benefit pension, then I think these states do have to bail out the local pensions. That happened here in Indiana when Mitch Daniels did a major tax reform that took over all the unfunded local pensions in the state. And so, getting rid of the pension liability, I think sending in the prosecutors to clean up some of these highly corrupt local governments. Many of these small towns are very, very, very corrupt. We got to root out the corruption. And, maybe some things on broadband, with something like Starlink, Elon Musk satellite service, who knows that we need to put fiber in place, but we went in a previous era, made sure people had electricity. We just decided that people in the country should have electricity. And I think we should decide people should have broadband. So I think providing those kinds of basic services and creating the financial space for them to do that and good governance around it is the most important thing we can do for these communities.
Thanks. Adam, did you want to get in on this?
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with any of the detailed policies Aaron put out there. Those are all essential things. Every struggling place should check those boxes, pension reform, that kind of thing. I do think that an important context for thinking about struggling places is that, yes, Aaron's right. A lot of these places they exist because of some industrial specialization that is no longer critical. And that leaves them less desirable places to live than they used to be. But while a lot of these places, have their problems, they remain, from a global perspective, extremely desirable places to live. Nobody here wants to live in Buffalo, right? Nobody in this room wants to live in Buffalo. But a lot of people around the world would love to live in Buffalo. And from a global perspective, it is a great place to live. And so I'm with John that I think, our proposal of heartland visas, allowing people to come there is going to, not every place can be helped, but I think that there are lots of places that can be helped. And I think that there will be decline, and a lot of the policies Aaron proposed are going to be crucial to making sure that decline can happen in a way that doesn't, make those places unbearable to live. But for the places that want to be helped and can be helped, I do think that heartland visas are a great way to do that. Another thing I would say that hasn't really been addressed is to talk about macroeconomics a bit, because I do think that there is a story there and that is relevant. Ed showed this chart of prime male labor force participation in 2015. And a lot of people would have looked at that chart and said 2015, this is as good as it gets because we're at full employment. We had 4 years of improving job growth after that. And those were 4 years where the prime employment rate for men continued to increase after that. And, disability is another category. People said disability is entirely a structural problem. The growth in disability rates are a hugely structural problem. There's nothing that macroeconomics can do about this. And what we've seen as labor markets got tighter over the last few years, disability rates came down. And so I do think that one of the problems we've had over the last 20 years is consistently weak demand and an economy that rarely was at full employment. And that if we do more there, that it's going to lift all boats, and especially, those that are the weakest. If you look at a phenomena like the China shock, I think that part of the problem there was those that, you had weak labor demand there for low skilled labor to begin with. When firms exposed to China trade exposure failed, the highest skilled workers there reallocated fine. The top third. It was really the bottom third that struggled with reallocation problem, and that's because recessions affect low skilled people more. And it's also because, if to look at the structural side of things, those places tended to have lower education levels overall, which reduces the ability of a place to reallocate. So I do think that, thinking about how do we get more skilled people there and how do we make recessions rarer and how do we get out of them faster will be something that helps.
Thanks, Adam. I want to be able to accommodate a couple of questions that we have from viewers. So the first question I'd like to toss out there is the question of avoiding cronyism and capture in economic development initiatives. So the question is essentially, how do you, if you're going to try to address some of the problems in distressed areas in a state or a city, how do you prevent your response from falling subject to cronyism or creating another sort of slush fund that just serves political purposes? Anybody want to take that one on?
I think it's the critical thing is to make sure that governments are focusing on the general business environment, the general quality of government, and to try and limit the one-off deals. I mean, I understand the one-off deals are very attractive. I understand attracting a big employer is a guaranteed front page of your local home newspaper. But we really have to create a national culture to the extent to which we can, which says, look, what you get points for is creating an ecosystem that enables small businesses to start, not in playing the zero-sum game of trying to get some big employer to reallocate. And there's much less cronyism involved in trying to create a good small business ecosystem. That is actually particularly critical post-COVID, right? We are living through, in some sense, a small business Armageddon, right? Small businesses which came into this with a tiny cash reserves. They were bailed out for a while by the Paycheck Protection Program, but the end is coming for many of these businesses. We just can't have the federal government keep on writing the checks. They're going to have to restart. But that's going to require an atmosphere around regulation, around permitting, that's going to make it possible for them to reopen. This is where our local government should be focusing, not on writing some big tax abatement check to some crony capitalist buddy.
If I could add to that real quick, I think it's actually worse than a zero-sum game. It's a negative-sum game, because at the end of the day, what you end up with is the biggest companies paying lower taxes. And so that increases concentration and it affects who the winners and losers are at the end of the day. But I think a problem is that it actually is sometimes rational for the local place to do this. A lot of places make mistakes. You can look at the data on local tax incentives and find many, many examples of places that paid way too much money for a big firm and just got ripped off. But I do think that sometimes it makes sense. And the problem is that it makes sense narrowly to them. It doesn't make sense from a US-wide perspective. And so I don't know whether the solution is more pacts between places, a federal incentive or something, but I think that economists are never going to win this fight by saying it doesn't make sense, because those local people, they can see this giant employer is going to come in here and sometimes they're going to make a mistake, but sometimes it's going to be right. So I think we need to start by recognizing the sometimes rationality there.
I don't disagree with that, Adam. I think the key is sort of making the case that this is at the national level, this is a losing game.
I think that I want to add to that, because I think where the losing argument really has been is in just stopping with don't do this, don't engage in the zero or negative sum game. where we really need to replace the political incentive is so strong to throw your hat in for Amazon or whatever the big location lottery competition is, that local leaders pay a very significant price for not being seen to be trying to recruit across state lines or to compete in those types of competitions. We have to give alternatives or rebalance the incentives so that local leaders are acting rationally in their own self-interest and not engaging in those types of games. I think it'd be interesting to think of how the federal government can use its leverage to reward places that don't engage in that type of activity, but instead do the thing that Ed was talking about, which is focus on the ground up type of ecosystem development to create the next Amazon, to really foster a culture that creates both the amenities and the ecosystem of fertile entrepreneurial activity. And there's a lot of things at the state and local level that are uniquely state and local that you can do to get out of the way of local entrepreneurs. And I think my hope would be that COVID refocuses policymakers on those things. We've already seen some pullback of occupational licensing rules to make it easier for health professionals, for example, to be able to deploy and the mobility that comes with that. But non-compete rules, occupational licensing laws, business licensing rules, zoning even, all of those things are uniquely within the control of state and local government. And there's just much more that they can do to create that kind of bottom-up environment so that there's less reliance on winning the location lottery.
Very good. I remember when I was advising Mike Pence in his first year as governor of Indiana, we were wrestling with this question of dying towns, right? That you've got these smaller metro areas that seem to be in decline and don't seem to bounce back. And they'd been used to participating in this activity of trying to bid against some other small town for the tire factory that would bring 150 jobs, in. And when we were in Boston for a conference that then Governor Pence was speaking at, we actually swung by Dr. Glaeser's office to get his counsel on a regional city strategy. He warned us about 5 or 6 things that we could probably do wrong, and I think we did all of them. I think at one point or another, we probably made those mistakes. But it carved the state up into 11 economic regions, and instead of that small town fighting over a tire factory, the incentive was for them to work with the nearest hub of economic activity on kind of a regional plan. And it was a matching fund system that raised a lot of private investment. And then that was when we thought he was going to be a 2-term governor, and this would have a lot of time to play out. I don't know that anyone's ever properly evaluated it, but it was an effort. I think Brookings has done some work looking into it, but it was an effort to try to address this issue regionally. And I'm not really sure I've seen any other states try it out, but the initial read on it was it met with some at least moderate success. So it's probably something also probably worth looking at. And one of the biggest proponents of it and the most vocal supporters of it back then was South Bend's Mayor Pete Buttigieg too. It was back in the happy days when everybody got along. We have another question that's come in and just asks what you foresee for lower wage urban workers who are disproportionately minority. The question is if more higher wage, higher skilled office work is shifting out of cities, what are the implications for lower wage workers in cities?
Well, it's bad, isn't it? It's bad both because of the demand shift that comes from the reallocation of other workers, and it's also bad because of so many of those workers are in jobs that actually rely on face-to-face contact. So that may not be the people who work doing the wholesale trade jobs, who work moving things around physically, but everyone who works in a restaurant or a cafe or a bar is vulnerable when people are afraid of face-to-face contact. So I think really this is a very difficult thing going forward. In some sense, when we want to think of that map that I showed, the whole challenge facing West Virginia prior to 2019 was those urban service jobs didn't exist, right? There weren't jobs that you could do taking care, providing services for high-end knowledge workers. Now, in a sense, if the cities lose their knowledge workers, or if the knowledge workers are frightened of hiring urban service workers, then in some sense, all of America's low formal skill job markets end up looking like the Eastern Heartland.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Thanks,
I think another factor there is the cost of living change, which should be some help to low-income people in a place like San Francisco, because when house prices and rents are falling like they are, I mean, the people who are going to be hurt by that adjustment period are going to be the homeowners and the landlords. But if you're a renter, the longer run picture, I totally agree with that. The short run is not a great outlook, especially if this recession turns more permanent job loss. But the longer term outlook, I think they should benefit somewhat from the lower cost of living in those places, especially because there's going to be disproportionately renters less likely to be homeowners.
Yeah, I think the big challenge is many of these cities are already struggling to attract high-end talent and jobs. So it's not like a place like, say, New York City, where they already had the high end of the economy locked up, and we have to figure out how to help lower income people. Many of these heartland cities, Eastern heartland cities, could say Cleveland would be in there. They're already struggling at the high end, and so they're compounds the issue with where do you focus your energy? They need to build up their high end and focus on the low end. And I think it was Ed who said something earlier that, if you start looking at your higher end businesses and people as an ATM machine, they might leave, and that could cause a problem. So I think it's a big challenge for a lot of these places, which have to focus across the entire economic spectrum, not just at one particular point on it.
Thanks. One other question I'll try to get in here from the audience before we run out of time is a question about offshoring. If it's becoming easier to do work from anywhere, does anyone have any concerns that companies will actually start paying people outside of the U.S. and that this remote work environment, both here and abroad, will make it easier for people to offshore jobs?
Yes, I used to work for one of the world's largest outsourcing firms, and they were always pushing us to work from home. And this was like a decade ago. And I said, I know how these people think. And what they'd think is, if I've proven that job does not have to be done in the office, I've already taken the first step to hiring someone in a low cost location to do it. So I definitely think that that's a risk. Another risk is that you disconnect yourself from the incredible value that comes from face-to-face conversations. If you think that you can stay career relevant when you've moved somewhere off the grid just because you can Zoom in, that's not going to carry you that long. Your networking, your skills are going to atrophy. That's why I think the long run appeal of the center is still going to be quite strong.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think in some sense we've all been coasting on fumes in terms of the working remotely, right? I mean, there's a whole bunch of things which are involved in building new skills, building new relationships that are just very, very hard to do remotely. And one piece of evidence that we had on that is the burning glass data on new hires. So, when you look at non-remotable jobs, both employment and new hires cratered immediately after COVID-19, but they're both back. When we look at remotable jobs, the employment stayed flat, but the new hires, the offers cratered, right? And they've stayed cratered. People are not looking to hire new workers who will just come in remotely. And I think it's just very hard to create connections that are sustainable and exciting that way. In terms of outsourcing, yeah, it's a risk, but also the current problems with any form of international travel, and given that many of these relationships actually need some form of face-to-face thing that's part of it, that will slow it down a little bit at least.
So the one thing to remember here is that, we had this warning about offshoring of jobs 10 years ago. Alan Blinder wrote a study, and he gave, several hundred occupations an offshoring risk score. And if you look the subsequent decade, what happened was those jobs didn't see lower job growth. What they did was they went remote. So businesses are looking to remote work first. And if you're looking for a lower cost of living hires, there's a lot of places within the US to go to. So this road to offshoring, it first walks through all these lower cost of living places. The other thing I can tell you is that, I work for the world's largest global freelancing platform, and that there is a strong preference for own country, right? There's a strong preference for own country. And in addition to that, US freelancers do a lot of work for global companies. So I understand, the fears here, but when you talk about something like low-skilled manufacturing jobs and the exposure to global trade there, it made sense that we don't do that anymore because that's not our specialization. But knowledge work is our specialization. Skilled services, that's our specialization. We're the richest, most productive country in the world, and if we're not the best at that, then why are we the richest, most productive country in the world? So I do think that there's going to be exporting opportunities there, and I can tell you that, we already see that happening.
Very good. Well, Adam, thanks for that. And thanks for those good closing words. I'm going to have to give you the last word as we've run out of time here. I'd really like to, and that went by fast. There's a lot more we could talk about. We might have to reschedule another session for the future, but Ed, John, Adam, Aaron, thanks so much for being with us today. And for all of you who've tuned in, thank you for your time and your questions. You'll be able to watch this again on AEI's website, and just stay tuned for future post-2020 seminars related to both cities and other topics. Thanks again, and everyone have a great day.
Thank you, Ryan.